Calvary Chapel, how you guys doing this morning? That was a little weak. Let's try again. How you guys doing this morning? That's better. Good to see you. If you're new, welcome to Calvary. It's your first time. Gosh, what an awesome day to come, and glad we got to move inside because of the smoke and heat, and it actually worked out really well. We've got a guest speaker this morning. He's got a bunch of visuals that would not have worked outside. We just not have been able to show them. You would have had to use your imagination. So he's going to be sharing about creation in the Grand Canyon specifically for your service. And by the way, if you missed this morning's first two services, I'm curious, how many people have been here since first service? Anyone raise your hand? All right, look at these diehard fans right here. And the reason being, they're not catching the same thing over and over. We've actually done 3 different things this morning already, which has been really neat. And so, or 2 different things. This will be the 3rd. And also tonight, there's going to be a 4th study on the amazing world of the honeybee. And so you want to catch that tonight at 6:30. And then I wanted to let you guys know all these studies are on YouTube, on our Facebook channel. And so if you missed first and second service, like the majority of you did, vast majority, you can check it out there. And so that's a great place to go and get this resource. It's been really a pleasure to have Dr. Steve Austin, who I'll introduce in a moment. And he's just been really a blessing to this fellowship in times past. And his ministry and what God's used him has been pretty amazing. So we're thankful to have him here again this morning. A couple announcements for you guys before we get into the study. Children's ministry is gearing up for this fall, and they're still looking for help. In fact, our children's ministry director will be after service out in the courtyard. You'll see him with a clipboard. You can hunt him down. His name is Greg. He looks very scary. He is not. He's a really sweet guy, and he told me that to ensure all of you that we have plenty of jobs available that don't involve children. Just in case you don't actually like kids, there's lots of stuff you can do over there in the kids ministry. You know, putting snacks together, you know, setting up computers, lots of stuff. I'm just putting that out there because a lot of people are like, well, I don't even like kids. And so you have no excuse not to serve in our children's ministry. And it is a great place, you guys, to get started, especially you've been coming to Calvary for a year. You want to get plugged in and meet some people and be a part of the body, a functioning part and serving part. That's a great place to get plugged in. So Greg will be there after service. You can also find anyone in the Sunday school. They'll love to point you to someone who could help you get signed up for that. On September 9th, we're having an 8-week video course titled Biblical Citizenship. And this course is a quick start guide to the Constitution and history and our biblical heritage, and will offer tangible steps for preserving liberty. And this is not a course that we're like the originators of, but it's something a third party has put together that we're hosting here at the church, just to let you guys know. And essentially, if you want to be a part of that, it's going to be every Thursday from 6:30 to 8:30, and there's a small cost associated with it, but if you want it, it's going to be in the Ed Building Thursday nights starting September 12th. And so that's a kind of a cool, not September 12th, September 9th. That's a cool little class on and history and our biblical stances and stuff like that. So there's that class. And then lastly, we were supposed to do baptisms after this service, but since we were inside and the baptismal is all the way down there, we want to walk. No, actually, just because of the smoke, we're going to kick it to next week. And so we'll be outside after third service next week doing baptism. So if you want to get baptized, our only prerequisite to do baptisms here is that you're saved, that you know Jesus. And so if you love Jesus, you've committed your life to him, and we would love to meet you out after third service next week to do baptism. So with that, let me introduce our guest speaker today. We're very honored to have here and having him share about his passion for God and how that looks in his life through the lens of a geologist. And he's been he was one of the first geologists at ICR, which is Institute for Creation Research, an amazing organization. If you guys aren't familiar with them, go check out their website, icr.org. I just remember this movie series, Genesis History, is an amazing documentary on biblical creation, and he's featured in that movie as well. I've shown that to my young adults. It's probably the best video I've seen, most well-done video I've seen on that. And then he's also led the world in studies of Mount St. Helens and the Grand Canyon, proving from geology and the authenticity of Scripture and the historical validity of a worldwide flood. And so we're very pleased to have Dr. Steve Austin. If you guys would give him a warm welcome this morning.
If you come tonight, I'll be talking about my hobby, which is beekeeping. And I'll be sharing a little bit about my and my wife's understanding of bees as we've come. And we'll probably have some honey in the back of the room to sample what that's like. But come hear about the incredible world of the honeybee tonight. Well, this hour, let's talk about Grand Canyon creation and the global flood. And I'd like to take you to Grand Canyon because it's one of the 7 wonders of the world. I think we have sound here. Yep. What makes Grand Canyon so amazing? It's 4,000 feet deep. It has a major river, the Colorado River, flowing through it. Scenery along the river and at the side of the canyon is incredible. The rim of Grand Canyon, south rim, is at 7,000 feet above sea level. The north rim of Grand Canyon is about 7,000 feet above sea level. The Colorado River is down below, over 4,000 feet below the rim. And as you look at the layers of Grand Canyon, you see the flat level layers that have been uplifted 7,000 or 8,000 feet above sea level, and you contemplate the inside story to the ground beneath our feet. We're looking at records of the geologic process that's formed the earth. What is that record? There are side canyons within the Grand Canyon that are bigger than most canyons that people are familiar with. 4 to 18 miles wide, 257 miles long, stretching through northern Arizona. And then there are those layers of rock under there. Rock layers, what do those represent? And how were they bent? And how were they deformed to make the earth that we see? And how did the erosion occur that allowed the canyon to be exposed for us to study? Let's put the pieces together. Get a view of Grand Canyon. I've got 5 pieces I'd like to put together, give you a good view of Grand Canyon. Grand Canyon creation and the global flood. Go to the rim of the Grand Canyon. 5 million people go to the rim of Grand Canyon every year to see Grand Canyon. It's one of the 7 major wonders of the natural world. I think people call it that. Grand Canyon has been become famous for what? Grand Canyon is famous for? If you talk to people about it, they'll tell you about deep time. Deep time. Primitive Earth. We're looking back there and we see something about the Earth in the past. The primitive Earth. Placid seas. You'll often hear people talk about how the sandstone and limestone layers, they provide evidence of the calm and placid seas in deep time. And then finally, slow erosion. Grand Canyon formed over tens of millions of years by the incessant, constant action of the Colorado River. Who has not been told the story that Grand Canyon was eroded by the Colorado River? during millions of years. It was in grammar school when I was a kid, and it's on TV documentaries, and it's all over the media. The Colorado River made Grand Canyon over millions and millions of years. Is it deep time? Is it primitive Earth? Is it placid seas? And is it slow erosion? So I'm the geologist who checked out the nature myth, if you will. I worked on radioisotopes and the deep time question. Believe it or not, I had $250,000 to spend on radioisotopes in Grand Canyon rocks, and I wrote a chapter in a book. Do radioisotope clocks need repair? Testing the assumptions of isochron dating using potassium argon, rubidium strontium, samarium neodymium, and lead isotopes. And I was involved with dating one of the most prominent layers in the Grand Canyon, that layer right there, the Bass Rapids diabase sill in the bottom of Grand Canyon. I used the four radioisotope dating methods: potassium argon, rubidium strontium, samarium neodymium, and lead isochron methods to date those rocks. That rock layer in the Grand Canyon, squeezed into the Hakkatai Shale, cooled rapidly. You should give one age. I got 4 different ages for the one rock layer. What is the true age of the diabase sill at Grand Canyon? Is it 1.8 billion years? The lead isochron age is at 1.5 billion years. The samarium neodymium age is at 1.1 billion years. The rubidium strontium age, or is it 0.8 billion years? The potassium argon age, or E? Multiple choice, none of the above. E. It could be none of the above. Okay, and anyway, it doesn't look like the radioisotope dating methods argue for deep time convincingly, at least to me. And having spent $250,000 on dating Grand Canyon rocks, I should be the one who is convinced of millions of years in the story about Grand Canyon. So I want to take you through the 5 different pieces of Grand Canyon as we look at the Grand Canyon rock layers. You see down at the bottom of Grand Canyon the crystalline rocks, the Zoroaster granite, the Vishnu schist. Then we have diagonally tilted layers deeply buried in Grand Canyon, the Grand Canyon supergroup. Then we have the great unconformity and erosion surface beveling the strata and rocks deeply buried, and then we have the 4,000 feet of flat-lying strata up to the rim, and we have a beveled surface at the rim. We even have volcanoes sitting at the rim, and then we have the erosional profile of the Grand Canyon. Here's the 5 pieces I'd like you to consider. Let's put them together, the 5 pieces. And you see ghosted in the background my my outline there, so I can do it. S, T, E, V, E, Steve. Okay, the 5 pieces are my name. Okay, sedimentation. Okay, we see the process of sedimentation reflected in the strata of the Grand Canyon. Sedimentation. T is tectonics. We see the upwarped ocean floor that was deposited in the past by sedimentation. It's been deformed and raised, and we see the process of tectonics. And then we see the erosional profile of the Grand Canyon, don't we? That's cross-cutting the strata and the tectonics, erosion, and then we see volcanoes on the rim of Grand Canyon that even overtopped the rim of the Grand Canyon, and lava spilled into Grand Canyon. And then we see the profile and the erosion of the present, and I think of exponential decline. The present is an exponential decline from the past. Things were going on in the past much more energetically than in the present. And so we've shut down sedimentation, tectonic erosion, and volcanoes into exponential decline. And that's my outline. Mount St. Helens, May 18, 1980, first hour I talked on Mount St. Helens. On May 18, 1980, a geologic event occurred that not only shocked the world's explosive power, but it challenged the way we think about geologic process in the past. And Mount St. Helens is an incredible laboratory for the study of all kinds of geologic processes. Like pyroclastic flows. These pyroclastic flows came out of the mountain in these ground-hugging slurries at 900 degrees Fahrenheit. The glowing avalanche of particles deposited these very interesting layers, and froze quickly, and we see where erosion is cut through the pyroclastic flow deposits, we can see the internal layering. And the internal layering is very fine. We see even fine laminae formed, of all things, during a hurricane. Strata, I thought, formed slowly, like between summer and winter, between wet years and dry years on the bank of the Columbia River, that type of thing. And the boundary between different layers represents, dry periods, that kind of thing. And so this idea that layers form rapidly at Mount St. Helens is a very important point that we need to consider for the formation of layers. For example, flume experiments have been run where we, in the glass wall of a flume, have dunes migrating downstream in a flow. And you can see not only layers form rapidly, but laminae within layers form rapidly. And so we understand something about the important layering in the Grand Canyon. And of course, those layers are very common, like the north rim of Grand Canyon. Here's a layer experiment. You can see how dunes migrate, and they're water dunes that migrate. And we think the layers form by large, big flows, big fast-moving flows, like a meter per second, 2 meters per second. That's the velocity that would build up these dune structures. And so we see that in the sandstone layers. And we see the layered sandstones, like the Tepic sandstone in the bottom of Grand Canyon. And we start thinking about what we've seen at Mount St. Helens, and some of those same structures can form rapidly. And in flume experiments, they form rapidly. Even grain settling process. For example, here we take 2 different grain sizes, we shake them up in a beaker, and we pour the sand. We've stained the sand 2 different colors. The finer grain we stained red, and we left the other coarser grains unstained, and creates layers. And grain flow and migration very rapidly makes lamination. We had thought that it takes years, tens of years, hundreds of years to form these kind of things. They can form rapidly in the grain flow process that we've seen at Mount St. Helens and in the flume experiments. Do mud rocks form rapidly? How do mud rocks form? And so the old idea of my generation was that mud accumulates very slowly from vertical fall of particles onto the sedimentary surface. And particles settle slowly. Like, for example, silt and clay particles might settle as much as 1 foot per hour, okay, through water, a single particle. And so imagining particles made of clay falling rapidly through fluid is folly to most geologists. And they think in terms of slow and gradual sedimentation of dispersed mud particles. And so that whole thing is going on. How do mud rocks form? There has recently been a revolution in mud rock thinking, and the mud rocks form in currents from particles which land at maybe a 15-degree angle from horizontal, not vertical fall, but at angle from horizontal, and that they're actually migrating dune forms, if you will. And this has been reproduced in flumes, what's called a racetrack flume. And it's a circular flume, and you have a drive section. It's kind of a Flintstone system where you run the paddles through the flume, and it drives the current in the upstream section and through the downturn, and then over here is where you see the layers form. We can make layers in the racetrack flume very rapidly, incredibly rapidly. These strata are made in the racetrack flume in a matter of seconds by migrating mud ripples, essentially. And the migrating mud ripples look, for all purposes, like what? The mud rocks, like, for example, the New Albany Shale in Ohio, for example, like a classic shale deposit. And in other words, millions of years are not required to make the laminated deposits and mud rocks. And this has been what's been called the Mudrock Revolution. The Mudrock, even geologists are referring to it as Mudrock Revolution. Stratification next to volcanoes in modern lakes and in continental shelves today form very rapidly. We have modern examples of this. Stratification in flume experiments forms very rapidly. And mud rocks, those are the rocks that we see on the surface of the earth very commonly. Mud rocks, the most basic rocks, about 2/3 of the rock record is mud rocks, are dominated by the structure of rapidly deposited sediment. And so mud rocks, and this mud rock revolution is among us. And so I'm a revolutionary. I talk to my students, and I'm a leader of the mud rock revolution. And we need to revolutionize the way geologists think about mud rocks. And of course, those layers are in Grand Canyon, right? So fine-grained sediment. These are quotes from McQuacker and Bohacks in Science magazine, for example. The mud rock, they call it the mud rock revolution. Fine-grained sediment is seldom deposited as individual grains, but commonly organized into grain aggregates. That's called flocculation. These studies indicate that many of the preconceptions about fine-grained rocks are naive. Mudstone science is posed for a paradigm shift. What is a paradigm shift? That is a big change in your thinking. And so I'm the leader. I'm one of the leaders of the Mudrock Revolution. Fortunately, I'm not the only one. Now, a man named Dave Sturm, a petroleum geologist in Bakersfield, California, said, "Steve, you've done a wonderful job of explaining how granular particulate material like sand can accumulate, and even mud can accumulate rapidly in a laboratory, silicate mud, silt particles. But don't you ever think about explaining limestone strata as formed rapidly, because there is proof positive of calm and placid seas, which over the geologic ages accumulated particles very, very slowly." The challenge from Dave Sturm. So it was like the very important challenge. So I went and I spent several years, over 10 years, studying one 7-foot thick limestone layer in Grand Canyon. There you see it. Over 10 years studying that particular layer. And you can see in the red wall limestone halfway down to the river, in the cliff is this 7-foot thick layer, 2 meters thick, and that is very distinctive because of its massive appearance, and then above it are the thin layered chert strata and limestone strata. That makes this very pronounced break in the red wall limestone, and that's what I've been studying. But in that limestone layer, that 7-foot thick limestone layer, about 2/3 of the way up in that layer, right along where I'm pointing there, is the nautiloid bed, the nautiloid layer. And there's a fossil called the nautiloid, and it's a straight-shelled cephalopod, like an octopus or squid in a straight shell. That's the way to look at it. And the nautiloid is a very important fossil in the Grand Canyon because there's billions of them that occur in that one layer. And I've been involved with mapping that layer and studying them. So it's an extinct marine creature resembling a squid, which had a solid chambered shell. And I've been studying nautiloids in Grand Canyon for over 10 years. I've been working on it. Made 28 river trips through Grand Canyon. I spent almost 2 years of my life below the rim of Grand Canyon studying, of all things, fossils. And so there you see the nautiloid fossil. You can see the shell tapering, and you can see the tip end of it, and then you can see the internal chambers that it cements off, and the animal lives in the big wide end. That's the story on the nautiloids. And we've been finding nautiloids. We started finding them at various locations.
We're here in the western Grand Canyon looking at the red wall limestone. The red wall limestone in this canyon, called Jeff Canyon behind me, shows an extraordinary sequence of strata. We see the thick-bedded limestone strata overlain by thin-bedded limestone and chert strata. This boundary defines the location where we find the nautiloid bed. The uppermost thick bed behind me is the nautiloid bed. This is where we've discovered all the nautiloids here in Grand Canyon.
And wow, did we discover a lot of nautiloids. We encountered them first at Nautiloid Canyon, where we saw hundreds of them on ledges around at the river level. And then I've been studying them all through Grand Canyon, into central Grand Canyon, for example, Whitmore Wash area, and down in Peach Springs area in the western Grand Canyon, especially Jeff Canyon, where that last video was shot. And then I found them out in Lake Mead area, on the mountains in Lake Mead, with red wall limestone out there in Nevada. And then eye level with the Stratosphere Hotel in Las Vegas on Frenchman Mountain, there are nautiloids in the red wall limestone. Something over 100 miles, 150 miles length of that limestone strata with nautiloids very densely packed. It is a colossal layer of nautiloids. My students and I have been studying it. Here's what we believe. We believe that nautiloids were swept up in a kind of a mud flow. And as the mud flowed over them, it swallowed them up, and then the mud flow collapsed to form that 7-foot thick deposit. It's not millions of years, it's a rapid sedimentary process that formed it. And we have modern examples of mud flows. For example, these volcanic mud flows associated with volcanic eruptions, they deposit layers like the nautiloid bed. You can imagine an underwater mud flow, something like that, making the nautiloid layer. Not millions of years, rapid sedimentation. So the challenge to explain limestone strata as rapidly deposited is also very important, and we need to think that way. So there's the nautiloid layer, and you can see the coarse fossils in the center of the layer. So the layer is about 7 feet in thickness, and the middle of the layer there has the coarse fossils, heads of coral, all kinds of crinoid and brachiopod and bryozoan pieces, but the nautiloids are very abundant right along there. And so we call it Whitmore nautiloid bed. It's in the Grand Canyon, and it's a very significant layer, and it formed in minutes, not millions of years. Modern observations in flume experiments have revolutionized sedimentation thinking with the understanding that strata deposition is a very catastrophic process. So sedimentation and ocean sedimentation over Arizona is what deposited the layers rapidly. That's what I see as I look at sedimentation, the process of sedimentation. Now let's talk about tectonics. Tectonics is the process that deforms the earth. And if you've paid attention to geologists' thinking, the geologists' thinking has been that North America and the Pacific Ocean basin are two tectonic plates that have interacted with each other. The key thing about Western North America, Washington, Oregon, California, is that is an oblique collision. There's an oblique collision or not head-on collision between the Pacific plate and the North American plate. The North American tectonic plate did not collide head-on. It collided in a diagonal way, and that collision created the San Andreas Fault and a lot of the Cascade Range volcanoes. And but it was a head-on collision with southern Alaska, okay? And you can see evidence of southern Alaska head-on collision by going up there, and it is very instructive. It tells us about the tectonics that formed Western North America. And I love going to Alaska, look at the glaciers and Glacier Bay, and the strata show that ocean floor has collided with the margin of the North American continent. And the process has been called subduction, the process of ocean floor being rammed down underneath North America, especially Alaska, by the head-on collision. And the layers in Alaska provide the evidence of it, and you can see somewhat of the tectonic deformation of the limestone and the shale layers of Alaska. And there's this big steep fault that is created by the underthrusting of the ocean floor underneath Alaska, believe it or not. And so southern Alaska has been essentially accreted or docked onto southern Alaska, and the continent has been enlarged by the flow of the Pacific Ocean floor. So imagine this: the present rate of movement is about 2 inches per year. So it grows about the rate at which your fingernail grows. But in the past, was that the rate in the past? As you look at the cross-section of the North American plate and the southern margin of Alaska, you can see where the ocean floor has been shoved down. Did the Pacific plate colliding with the North American plate at 2 inches per year create the Wrangell Mountains, okay, the Yucatan terrain, the Kodiak, and the offshore trench? Strong subduction of the past Melted rock in faults cause enormous molten blobs called plutons to form, enormous volcanoes, and uplifted the highest mountains in North America. Right there in Alaska, you can see it. But you look at the strong subduction of the past, and you can see what? Weak subduction of the present. We have breccia in faults today. We have small dikes and sills, small volcanoes, and low mountains, and the ocean trench offshore. Here's Kodiak Island, geologists out there, and we're looking at the fault surface where North America overrode the Pacific plate as the Pacific plate was shoved underneath Kodiak Island in southern Alaska. And you see on the fault, it looks like coal, it looks like a coal bed, but that's melted rock in the fault. Melted rock in the fault requires enormous displacement. In other words, friction had to break the rock apart so fast that, and that friction was so intense that it melted the rock. Modern magnitude 8 earthquakes don't create liquid rock or melt rock on faults. It powders rock. And so we see melted rocks on faults in Alaska. The technical name is called pseudo-tachyllite, and it's evidence of superfault. So we have superfault in Alaska, which implies what? A superquake, like a magnitude 10 quake or something like that, which implies super tectonics, which because it's happening on the ocean floor, what does it propose? A super flood, okay, a super flood, tsunamis on a colossal scale, which would what? Require survival by boat. Okay, are you following where I'm going with this? When you have super tectonics, you have all the things, and you have super sedimentation. You have everything you need to have a global flood on the Earth. And so I see, looking at Alaska and Western North America, the evidence of colossal sedimentation and tectonics. And you see that like in the mountains in Southern California. Mountains have been broken off at the roots and they slide on 1-degree slopes. Intense super earthquakes. And so Grand Canyon is telling me about super sedimentation, super tectonics, and super process in the past. There was a man named Antonio Snyder, an earth scientist. He wrote the book, Creation as Mysteries Revealed, Creation as Mysteries de Volier, Creation as Mysteries Revealed, 1859. He wrote about the supercontinent being once joined together, and he proposed that it split apart. And he proposed that it split apart catastrophically and caused a global flood. 1859 is when he published. Do you know anybody else that published in 1859? Charles Darwin published Origin of Species in 1859. Antonio Snyder's book went on the shelf to be what? Gather dust. And but Darwin was heralded by the global community. And so super tectonics, strong tectonics of the past, and the idea of the supercontinent breaking apart during a global flood, that was Antonio Snyder's view. Tectonics, strong tectonics of the past preceded the weak tectonics of the present. Tectonics may be occurring at the rate at which your fingernail grows, but is that what's responsible for forming Western North America, the Cascade Range, going down into California and up into Alaska? No, strong subduction of the past preceded the weak subduction of the present. Okay, let's talk about erosion. And we see very beautifully preserved the elevated plateau in Colorado Plateau in Arizona. And what do we see? The deep canyon, 4,000 feet below the rim of Grand Canyon. and we have the evidence of erosion. You know, at Mount St. Helens, we had catastrophic erosion by mud flows of all things, overtopping flows and spillover erosion, which on March 19, 1982, eruption created a mud flow which eroded canyons over 100 feet deep through solid rock and breached through the landslide debris and made a miniature Grand Canyon 1/40th scale. So you're looking out there, you see the cup-shaped side canyons, gully heads, and you see the breach did not occur straight through. It has a snaky path, and we're looking at a miniature Grand Canyon 1/40th scale. And there's Grand Canyon. It looks like there was once a lake to the east of Grand Canyon. Could that lake have breached through the upwarp terrain called the Kaibab upwarp, spilled into the basin in the central Grand Canyon, filled in that basin, overtopped another topographic dam, and that cut back and eroded Grand Canyon? A series of spillover events from top down, catastrophic flow and drainage. So my thought is that these lakes on the Colorado Plateau breached through the Kaibab upwarp, creating Grand Canyon. It wasn't the Colorado River that cut Grand Canyon, it was overtopping and spilling of lakes on the rapidly formed tectonic terrain that created the features. And there's 20 geologists out there at least that are thinking favorably about this origin for Grand Canyon. And most geologists have jettisoned the idea that Grand Canyon formed over tens of millions of years by the action of the Colorado River. Sounds like heresy, but it's true. Geologists generally know tens of millions of years of Colorado River erosion didn't form the canyon. And then right here, you have Palouse River Gorge. Isn't that cool? Okay, how many have been out to Palouse, seen that? Yeah, okay, the Lake Missoula flood came through the whole Columbia Basin here and radically modified it. And look at that, solid rock, lava flows. Columbia River basalt was eroded 400 feet deep by catastrophic erosion. There's the railing at Palouse. You can see the people there, but that's a colossal canyon. And that's it goes down Snake River, and Snake River comes into Columbia River, and that whole area upstream is evidence of catastrophic erosion. So there's no place on earth you can't go without finding catastrophic erosion, like right here in Palouse. And Well, Lula Gap is formed by floodwater drainage from a giant lake in Montana that breached its ice dam and spilled down through Spokane into the Pasco Basin here and spilled over the topographic divide. And so the Columbia River is basically a series of spillover events. And so we're talking about how the Earth really formed. We're not imagining some kind of evolutionary process. We're trying to explain things. Erosion, sheet erosion, and widespread beveling of the past preceded channelized erosion of the present. And you can see that by looking at Grand Canyon. There's a rim of Grand Canyon called the Kaibab Plateau. And the Kaibab limestone at the Kaibab Plateau surface is about 7,000 feet above sea level. It looks like it's been planed off. It's been planed off flat, okay? And then what's happened, that planing has given way to channel erosion, like the main channel. So beveling of the general surface of the Colorado Plateau, then overtopping and channeling of the terrain, creating Grand Canyon. And so as you see Grand Canyon and erosion, you think of beveled surfaces and then channelized flow and canyon erosion. So Grand Canyon provides a convenient very convenient understanding of catastrophic erosion, not slow and gradual action of the river. Now, volcanoes. Let's talk about volcanoes. By the way, did you see the volcanoes on the north rim of Grand Canyon? They spilled into Grand Canyon. So the volcanoes are a second feature or a later feature after the sedimentation, the tectonics, and the erosion. And so volcanoes, we put volcanoes in perspective. And of course, here in Washington State, we know about the Cascade volcanoes, but we have the Yellowstone volcanoes, right? The Yellowstone volcanoes are very important. And there's a giant elliptical depression of a major part of Yellowstone National Park, which is a giant collapsed volcano. When that volcano erupted, it had more than 2,000 times the magma that Mount St. Helens had. And as it erupted, it jettisoned that material, and then it collapsed into the hole that formed. And Yellowstone Lake is the collapse structure from the collapse of the volcano and the elliptical depression. And geologists have come to that understanding of Yellowstone, this is a giant collapsed volcano, had more than 2,000 times the explosion power of Mount St. Helens. And so here's Mount St. Helens volcanic ash. Okay, there it is, Mount St. Helens. And you see the volcanic ash spread from Washington State and a little bit of Oregon into Idaho and over into Montana. And it had about a quarter cubic mile of ash in that. And then you can see back some of the other volcanoes of history. But back Yellowstone eruption, the last Yellowstone, had over 600 cubic miles of ash, more than 2,400 times the explosion power of Mount St. Helens, or the volume of that eruption. And we can see the Independence Dike Swarm in California, that's the likely explosion products from enormous amounts of volcanic ash that are in the Brushy Basin member of the Morrison Formation, which is the volcanic deposit that's burying the dinosaurs in the western North America. And so this giant deposit that sits buried under there, that's called the Morrison Formation, is 4,000 cubic miles of volcanic ash in that interval. And we're talking about Mount St. Helens, a quarter cubic mile of ash. And in other words, the volcanoes of the past have been a lot bigger than the volcanoes of the present. And we're seeing the winding down of volcanoes. So super volcanoes of the past, small volcanoes of the present. And there's the ash from the eruption of the volcanoes in California, the Independence Dike Swarm. Here's the Yellowstone eruption, and there's Mount St. Helens. That small little bleep there, and little blip there, it's almost microscopic in that image. That's Mount St. Helens. So what is Mount St. Helens? It's a small volcano compared to experience, even human history, but certainly in volcanic history, it's a small volcanic eruption. Volcanoes illustrate the declining power of eruption with times. And so this idea of declining power with time, the geologic power of process declines with time. And so you can imagine Creation Week. There's a lot going on during the first 3 days of Creation Week as God is forming the continents. On day 3, the continents are formed and the ocean basins are formed, and then life is created. Living things are created on the continents and the oceans. And then there's calm and placid process, and then we had the global flood in the days of Noah, and then we had high geologic process rates, lots of sedimentation, tectonics, and erosion, and then the whole thing has been declining since then to now. And so that's what's called exponential decline. The declining power of time. The power of geologic process has been declining after the flood. Exponential decline. exponential decline is like the new car I drove off the, that's the value of the car declining with time. That's what happened to geologic process. Are they still painting the Sistine Chapel? Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel, and he did a marvelous job, but they're doing a little bit of touch-up, on the magnificent walls of the chapel and the ceiling, but declining power with time. So that's what we're seeing, and that's what geologic process is showing us. The Apostle Peter's words to be remembered. He says, knowing this, in the last days there will come scoffers, walking after their own lusts, and saying all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation, 2 Peter chapter 3. All things continues just as it was from the beginning. In other words, Peter is warning about latter-day scoffers who will come and say all things continue as they were from the beginning. In other words, the uniformitarian or gradual way of thinking, the evolution of the earth way of thinking. And then Peter goes on to say, they're willing anger this, that by the word of God the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and by water, through which the world at that time was destroyed, being flooded with water, the global flood. And so Peter is refuting the latter-day scoffers in a prediction that they'll come, and he's saying that creation and the flood are the antidote to the slow and gradual thinking. So exponential decline, geologic processes were greatly accelerated in the past and now have slowed significantly, telling us the general story of exponential decline. So the 5 pieces of the puzzle for understanding Grand Canyon. We got the 5 pieces, kind of put them together, and helps you understand and gives you the big picture of Grand Canyon. The first S is S is sedimentation. So we're seeing the process of sedimentation, which left its imprint on the strata layers that are formed in Grand Canyon. So we see the process of sedimentation. Those deeply buried strata probably relate to Creation Week. These flat-lying 4,000 feet of strata in Grand Canyon provide the evidence of a global flood, I believe, and sedimentation is the process. And then we see the whole plateau uplifted above sea level in places 8,000 feet above sea level, and we see the process called tectonics. Evidently, the North American plate and the Pacific plate collided in some type of catastrophic way, and that created the global flood and the tectonics associated with the global flood. And we see the formation of a 250,000 square mile plateau called the Colorado Plateau. And then, of course, we have the Columbia River Plateau, and we have and all the erosion that we see on those plateaus. The erosion followed the tectonics largely and became channelized. First, we had the beveling of the surface, the general retreat of the flood off the earth, forming the beveled surface of the Colorado Plateau and the Columbia River Plateau, and then we have the erosion which occurred later, channelized flow, the formation of Colorado River, Columbia River, that type of thing. And then we have volcanoes, and boy, do we have a lot of volcanoes around, okay? And, but yeah, they're small volcanoes and evidence of exponential decline. So Grand Canyon tells a story consistent with the understanding of Scripture. We see evidence of Creation Week, likely first 3 days of Creation Week, the retreat of the oceans during Creation Week into basins, and then we see the upheaval of the ocean floor associated with the collision of continents, and then the 4,000 feet of fossil-bearing flood-laid strata, and then we see the retreat of the flood in the beveled surface, and then we see the post-flood overtopping and breaching of the terrain. So Grand Canyon provides evidence of a global flood. The global flood in Scripture, the waters were upon the face of the whole earth. Genesis 8, verse 9. It wasn't a local flood. The waters were upon the face of the whole earth. In Genesis 7:19, all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. Hebrew superlative. You can't say any more emphatically in the Hebrew language that the flood was over everything. All the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. And of course, Peter says, 2 Peter 3:6, the world that then was being deluged with water perished. Thank you. Yeah, come tonight and hear me talk about beekeeping.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Come back tonight, guys. And then also check out the table afterwards. Go watch the first studies if you missed them this morning. But let me pray you guys out. Why don't you all stand? Lord, thank you so much for this morning. Thank you. We have faithful men and women who study this kind of stuff that a lot of us would never get a chance to dive into. And Lord, Grand Canyon is such a unique feature, and it's been something that is for years been told of how old the earth is because of it. And Lord, I just thank you for people with some reason and sense to go through and study this from a biblical perspective and show us, Lord, that these things do align with our faith. These things do align with what history and geology show us, Lord. And so we just pray that you continue to bless Dr. Steve and his ministry and what he's doing, Lord, and the work that he's done. And God, you just bless your people today, too, as we go home and we have good conversations. And you just bless the things we're doing, and we would be about your business. That's just your name. Amen.